Assalamu alaikum. I'm here to tell you a story. Once upon a time, we were all a lot less distracted than we are today. There was no Facebook back then, no Twitter, no YouTube, no Instagram. In fact, it's crazy when you stop and realize just how much has changed. Especially if you consider that today, for most of us, our lives revolve around these things, whether it's tweets, photos, or let's say status updates. You see, social media has changed the media industry forever, and it'll never be the same. Traditional news organizations no longer own the news anymore because they no longer control the world's largest publishing platforms. In fact, social media companies do. What's even crazier is that this time that I'm talking about wasn't so long ago, just 10 years. Social media hasn't only transformed the news business, it has changed the way we communicate with each other. It's changed the way we communicate with friends and families, with journalists and corporations, as well as with governments. Give me a quick show of hands. How many of you have used Facebook, Twitter, Instagram to receive some news today? Okay, so this side of the room is awake and this side of the room is sleeping. Malish. How many of you have done the same through TV or newspapers today? There's one hand. There's only one hand. See, I guess I'm not the only social media addict here. In fact, I bet that a good number of you are probably discreetly Instagramming or liking photos and probably not listening to what I have to say. But you see, to understand the role of social media in terms of how it affects the future of news, let's look at the past. Here in the Arab world, the so-called social media phenomenon was most obvious during the Arab uprisings. Citizens across the Arab world used social media to connect with each other, to mobilize, sharing their grievances with others and with the world, telling their own stories, and hoping to change their lives. More than any other event in history, these events marked the shift in power in media, the decentralization of information. You see, back in December 2011, we found ourselves fortunate enough to be immersed in a series of chaotic and fateful events that, for me, deprived me of sleep. For some like me, it catapulted our careers, but most importantly, it connected us through social media with each other as Arab brothers and sisters. But most importantly, it revealed something very clear to us, and me as a journalist in particular, just how critical social media would become to the future of news. It was clear and widely discussed in terms of the Arab world going through a period of revolution. But what wasn't discussed was how the media was going through a similar revolution. And just as Arab governments at the time were scrambling to respond to the precarious political situation, the media organizations were scrambling to understand the very same thing and cover the story. You see, the same week that Mohammed Bouazizi in Tunisia set himself on fire, I arrived in Washington, D.C. to help launch the stream for Al Jazeera English. Now, this was a talk show that aimed to tap into conversations that were already happening on social media, leverage those voices, and report on stories that the mainstream media was missing. Now, towards the end of December, I had stumbled across the hashtag Sidi Bouzid, the town that Mohammed Bouazizi was from. Almost instantly, I called up hundreds of photos and videos showing students protesting, police abuses, and sporadic gunfire. Within a matter of minutes, I interviewed students via Skype who told me school was canceled. They sent photos of injured protesters, videos of chaotic hospitals, and the only place I could look to corroborate these photos was the wires. But when I looked there, I didn't find anything. Now, I would quickly come to realize that the beginning of a revolution was unfolding, in some ways thanks to social media, and I had a front row seat, even though I was all the way in Washington, D.C. Now, for more than a week, I watched the story unfold, speaking to activists using Facebook, Skype, Twitter, as protests turned bloody. But it wasn't until January 12th, more than 2 or 3 weeks after the incident had happened, that Time magazine finally found the story. You see, we live in a world where mainstream media exclusivity no longer exists. Of course, the way that this story was covered by mainstream organizations in the West was, I guess you could say, incomplete. In the West, they openly positioned themselves with what they called the brave young Arab protesters. The narrative that emerged in traditional media was somewhat simplistic. The story was framed as young Arabs rising up using social media and Western-built technologies to mobilize, to demand dignity, and even to overthrow their government. Sure, there was truth to that narrative, but it wasn't the whole truth. Now, on social media, there was a much more comprehensive story, and it was a complicated conversation, even if it was one that needed to be curated. And this is where there was a more complete picture. See, the role of traditional journalists is increasingly to use the abundance of information that's out there to provide context and to connect the dots. For example, during the early days of the uprising in Egypt, much of the mainstream media's coverage, particularly in the US, overlooked facts, including the fact that Hosni Mubarak was one of the US government's closest allies, that decades of murder and indefinite detention for activists and journalists had been supported by the US government. See, this is where social media has inherent value, in filling the gaps and providing context to news stories through crowdsourcing information, and in doing so, giving the voiceless a voice. Another example, the most recent war between Israel and Gaza. For the first time ever, the offensive played out in vivid detail on social media, with the bombings and the killings documented through photos and videos on the ground in real time by journalists, but also by ordinary citizens. For the first time ever, a conflict that dates back decades was being seen in real time, through the eyes of those who were living there. Now, the network design of social media at its core threatens those in positions of power. I'm not talking about Ali Jabir. Whether authoritarian regimes or authoritative traditional media outlets. For example, in 1991, when Al Jazeera first emerged as the pan-Arab 24-hour news channel, it presented stories that openly questioned a lot of the status quo. For better or worse, people liked it, people didn't like it, but the simultaneous emergence of pan-Arab satellite television as well as social media inspired a slow media revolution or evolution. If you look at the entire Arab world, in 2013, there were 54 million Facebook users. Just 1 year later, in 2014, the number was 82 million. The Arab world has one of the highest technology adoption rates of all developing nations. There are more than 400 million mobile devices and millions of other internet-connected devices in the Arab world. There are more than 135 million internet users in the Arab world, and more than 71 million of them actively use social media today. And according to a report by the Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government, the internet was the primary source of news for 35% of its respondents. The #1 use of social networking platforms was what? Not to tweet photos of your food on Instagram, but to get news information and advice on various issues. You see, the real shift behind social media's effect on traditional media is that experts are no longer experts. The crowd is. The new expert can be defined as the person who has personal knowledge and insight and knows how to engage with the crowd and find a niche experts in any given situation. Traditional experts are now media brokers that has already been gathered by the crowd. So in a sense, you could say that traditional journalists are now the Google of social media information. You see, the modern newsroom today has so-called optimization departments that aim to increase the way stories function on social media. They have data analysts who look through information about how each story performs to help inform how headlines should be written, how photographs should be presented, and which stories actually resonate with an audience. In the US, a new report from Pew shows that while the news industry has lost more than 1/3 of its newsroom jobs in traditional newsrooms, there are now more than 5,000 jobs in digital news. 3,000 of these positions are at 30 big digital news outlets, because this is where the most nuanced conversations are happening, the most informative conversations are happening. After all, people want their news as soon as it happens. You may remember the death of Osama bin Laden. The story famously broke on Twitter when Keith Urban, the chief of staff to the former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, tweeted, "So I'm told by a reputable person they've killed Osama bin Laden, hot damn." Meanwhile, I was watching TV and you saw anchors scrambling on air, trying to articulate sentences, not sure if they should confirm the news, not sure if it was embargoed. And on social media, the reality is that the standards and the ethical values that traditional media outlets must ascribe to do not apply. For better or worse, this puts pressure on mainstream news organizations to compete with the speed and the breadth of information that's being shared on social media. Digital and social media have surpassed TV and print in terms of audience size and engagement frequency. Now, it's hard, and I can't presume to actually pinpoint all the reasons why, but the truth is, part of it is the convenience and the perceived comprehensiveness of news search results, whether on Google or social media. Now, no matter what happens in the media business in the future, we will always need informed, recognizable, and trusted sources to tell stories. But the ability to recognize trends before they happen, to identify issues that resonate emotionally, has more value in this democratized media environment than ever before. Beyond speed, social media has also triggered a new objectivity. See, in the past, news organizations had to rely on objectivity and aspire to it. The aim was that through objectivity, people would believe they were consuming journalism that people can trust. But in the digital age, transparency is what makes your audience trust you. Now, this doesn't mean that news can be inaccurate. It still has to be accurate and fair. But the audience has a growing need and interest in seeing how that news is actually produced. Now, on the flip side, there's a lot of propaganda on social media. A lot of it parades as news. There's a lot of false information. But one could argue that the same is true for traditional media. You know, here in the Arab world, I have to tell you, as a consumer, as a producer of news, I'm encouraged to see conventional media outlets, as well as pan-Arab satellite networks, tap into this space to start the process of adopting a much more multifaceted, multi-platform approach. You know, in the Arab world, we've seen some news organizations try and fight certain issues such as censorship by using the social media phenomenon to their advantage to leak stories on social media, aiming to preempt any crackdowns on free speech and censorship. Now, one radical impact social media is having on journalism is how fast a story moves. Borders and cultural boundaries that once limited a story's audience, limited its reach, don't matter with platforms that are aimed to globally connect people and really finally live up to what the internet was aimed to be in the beginning, which is a global village. On a daily basis, you see TV broadcasters use footage gathered by citizen journalists who just so happen to be on the ground when a story breaks, but they don't often credit them. For better or worse, speed and scale are dominating the information world. We're seeing the rise of the first generation of large-scale digitally native news organizations. Now, publishing anything, whether it's an individual sitting in a seat, whether it's a journalist in a news center, has always been a dangerous business. But today, when we don't know the identity of publishers, when we don't know if terrorist organizations are publishing propaganda, parading it as news, corrupt corporations also doing the same, it can seem all the more dangerous. Now, what I can tell you about social media and the future of news is that in the present, social is mobile. And that trend is going to continue. Readers are consuming media on smaller mobile devices, which call for shorter posts. And there's a reason news organizations, both old and new, are increasingly looking for ways for social media to attract new audiences, particularly younger demographics. Now, in the future, multi-platform storytelling will reign supreme because it recognizes the iterative nature of storytelling. Audiences increasingly want authenticity, they want transparency, and sometimes they'll forgive objectivity. Sure, there are issues with social media, and I could spend the next 5 to 10 minutes talking about verification and other things, but the same can be said of traditional news organizations. In fact, in some ways, social networks have made it easier to verify the accuracy of a story by tracking down a source. Using geolocation data, we can find and scour tweets coming from a particular location that may uncover insights that we might have missed in the past. I would be lying if I told you I can predict the role of social media in the future of news. But you'd have to have your head in the ground not to recognize the growing role social media is going to play, the amount of data that will be available. So personalized content, which all of you participate in one form or another, will actually become the norm. And I would imagine our experience as consumers of news will be all the more individualized. You'll get the content you want, when you want it, from the people you want it, even if it's not from a news organization that you follow. So, with that said, it's the responsibility of traditional media to recognize that and continue to find ways to be part of the process. Now, please feel free to go back to Instagramming, and if you want to, take a picture of this stage with me on it and use the hashtag #BestSpeechEver. Thank you very much.